It's early morning in the woods. The kind of morning where everything looks normal at a glance. Mist hanging low between the trees, damp leaves sticking to the ground, the world still feels half asleep. But nothing about this morning is normal. Somewhere off the path, a 12-year-old girl is crawling. She's injured, barely conscious. Every movement is an effort she shouldn't have to make. Her body is telling her to stop, but something stronger than her is pushing her forward. Just a little farther, just far enough, until someone sees her. And what happened to her didn't begin here. It didn't begin in these woods. It began long before this moment, before fear, before violence, before anyone understood what was really going on. Because when investigators would later piece this case together, they wouldn't just be asking what happened. They'd ask how. How do two children, two friends, end up believing that killing someone is necessary to please a creature that doesn't even exist? How does a fictional character become a command? How does imagination turn into intent? And more importantly, how did nobody see this coming? Because this doesn't start with the crime scene. It starts with childhood, isolation, belief systems forms in places adults rarely ever think to look. And once it begins, it moves faster than anyone could stop. My name is Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead up to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when truth finally catches up. Today's episode takes us to the quiet suburbs of Wisconsin, where the line between a childhood game and a deadly obsession didn't just blur, it vanished. We're looking at a case that forced the world to ask, what happens when a monster created by the internet finds its way into the minds of children? This is the story of the Slender Man stabbing. To understand how something so dark could take root, you first have to understand Waukesha. Located about 20 miles west of Milwaukee, it is the quintessential American suburb. In 2014, it was the kind of place people moved to specifically because things like this don't happen there. It's a city of parks, historic brick buildings, top-tier schools, a place where the community pride is visible in every manicured lawn and local festival. The air in Waukesha feels safe. It's the kind of town where parents let their kids bike to the library or walk to the neighborhood park without even a second thought. There's a profound sense of predictability to life here. The neighborhoods are quiet, the streets are lined with old-growth maples, and the social fabric is woven with Midwestern politeness. It was, by all accounts, a protected bubble. But that's the thing about a bubble. It's transparent, but it's also a barrier. While the adults in Waukesha were focused on the physical safety of their streets, a different kind of world was being built inside the glowing screens of middle schoolers. The world that raised them wasn't just the quiet streets of Waukesha. It was the early 2010s internet. This was an era where the digital frontier was still a bit of a Wild West for parents. While the physical setting of this story is a sun-drenched suburban park, the mental setting is much darker. A place of infinite scroll, unchecked forums, and the birth of modern digital folklore. The contrast couldn't be sharper. On the outside, the peace of a Saturday morning in May. On the inside, a terrifyingly vivid obsession that was about to shatter their peace forever. Now, to the outside world, our two middle schoolers, Geyser and Anissa Weier, were just two awkward sixth graders navigating the social minefield of Horning Middle School. Behind closed doors, though, their allegiance was becoming a closed circuit, a shared reality that was increasingly detached from the world around them. Morgan was in many ways the architect of this fantasy. Friends and family described her as bright, highly imaginative, and deeply withdrawn. She had a penchant for the macabre, often seen drawing dark imagery in her notebooks. But for Morgan, the line between a vivid imagination and fractured reality was chemically very thin. Crucially, there was a genetic shadow hanging over her development. Her father, Matthew Geyser, struggled with schizophrenia and had been hospitalized in the past for it. For Morgan, the early warning signs were there, though they were dismissed as simply quirks. She would later tell evaluators that she had been seeing and hearing things since she was a toddler. Hallucinations that she referred to as characters, like Maggie from The Walking Dead, or different characters from Harry Potter. By the time she met her best friend Anissa, Morgan was already living in a world where the fiction was not very different from reality. To her, Slender Man was not a legend. He was a tall, faceless man who stood in her room and demanded blood to spare her family. Then we have Anissa Weier. If Morgan provided the vision, Anissa provided the validation. Anissa was a child who desperately wanted to belong. She had struggled with the social dynamics of middle school, often feeling isolated and seeking a best friend who could offer her a sense of security. When she found Morgan, she found someone who accepted her completely, but that acceptance came with a price. Anissa's psychological profile was defined as highly suggestible and a delayed emotional development. She wasn't experiencing all the same hallucinations as Morgan, but she possessed a powerful desire to believe in something bigger than just her mundane suburban life. She looked to Morgan for cues on how she should perceive the world. And when Morgan told her that Slender Man was real and they needed to become his proxies and prove their worth, Anissa didn't question it. She leaned into it. She became the pragmatist for the delusion, helping to research the mansion and planning the logistics of how they would travel to Nicollet National Forest after the deed was done. The tragedy of this case lies in Folie, or a shared psychotic disorder. Individually, these girls might have just remained the weird kids in the back of the classroom. Morgan might have eventually received clinical intervention thanks to her father's history, which suggested that she really needed it. And Anissa might have found a different social circle that could have anchored her. But together, they were creating a feedback loop. Every time Morgan shared a vision, Anissa confirmed how important it was. Every time Anissa showed interest, Morgan felt empowered to dig deeper into her darkness. These kids weren't killers in the traditional sense. They were two very vulnerable children who had built a bunker out of a myth, reinforcing the walls until they couldn't see the light of reason anymore. By the morning of the sleepover, they weren't acting out of malice. They were acting out of a terrifying, self-imposed necessity. Now, before she was a headline, Payton Leutner was a vibrant, kind-hearted 12-year-old girl who loved animals, music, and being a loyal friend. To those who knew her as Bella, she was the girl who went out of her way to be inclusive. In fact, her kindness is what led her to Morgan Geyser in the first place. While other children were put off by Morgan's eccentric behavior and withdrawn nature, Payton saw someone who she thought needed a friend. She had been Morgan's best friend since 4th grade, acting as a social anchor for a girl who had trouble navigating the world. The sleepover that would happen on May 30th, 2014 was supposed to be a typical preteen milestone, a celebration for Morgan's 12th birthday. There were roller skating rinks, birthday cake, and the kind of whispered secrets that define middle school friendships. Payton arrived at the Geyser household with a sleeping bag and a sense of excitement, completely unaware she was entering a space that had been transformed into a tactical planning zone. To Payton, the night was about celebrating her best friend. To Morgan and Anissa, this was the eve of the sacrifice. And this is where the element of betrayal almost is too much to stomach. Throughout the evening, they played and laughed, while Morgan and Anissa secretly whispered about how and when they were going to kill the girl sitting right next to them. They had originally planned to do it at the sleepover while Taylor was sleeping, but Morgan said she couldn't go through with it in the house. Instead, they waited until the morning, luring Payton into a game of hide-and-seek in David's park. Payton followed them into the woods because she trusted them. She had no reason not to. When they told her to lie down and cover herself with leaves as part of the game, she did it. Not out of fear, but out of a shared sense of just playing like children do. The betrayal wasn't just the physical violence that would follow, it was the systemic dismantling of a years-long friendship. Payton wasn't a random target. She was the person who had always shown Morgan the most consistent compassion. And in the warped logic of the shared delusion, that was exactly what made her necessary to become an offering to Slender Man. And as we look at the logistics of the catch later, we have to remember this moment. The image of a young girl following her two best friends into the trees, expecting a game, and instead just finding a nightmare. Now, I'm sure by now you're wondering, how does a fictional character created on the internet become a monstrosity? Well, to understand how a fictional character can command a real-world stabbing, we actually have to look at what we call the birthplace of modern monsters, creepypastas. For people who didn't grow up with a tablet in your hand, think of creepypastas as the digital equivalent of passing around a ghost story at a campfire. Except the campfire never actually goes out, and the story gets edited by thousands of people online in real time. The name comes from copypasta, text that is copied and pasted across the internet, but with a creepy twist. These were short, user-generated horror stories designed to be shared on forums like 4chan or the Creepypasta wiki. And in the early 2010s, no character loomed larger in the digital shadows than Slender Man. Slender Man wasn't actually born into ancient folklore. He was created in 2009 by a man named Eric Knudsen for a Photoshop contest. He was depicted as this unnaturally tall, thin man in a black suit with a blank, featureless white face. But the internet did what the internet does, and it took that single image and it gave it a pulse. Within years, there were thousands of stories, found footage videos that had been created on Blender. Fan-made games were created. In this world, Slender Man was a stalker. He lived in the woods. He always targeted children. And most importantly to our story, he had proxies, servants who did his bidding in exchange for protection. But first, you had to prove you were worthy to enter Slender Man's world. For a 12-year-old like Morgan or Anissa, this wasn't just a scary story. It was an immersive reality. The early 2010s were the golden age of the blurred line. You didn't just read about Slender Man. You watched leaked, grainy videos that looked like real police evidence. You read forum posts from people who claimed they had seen him in their own backyards. For vulnerable children, this created a dangerous psychological trap. We call it the suspension of disbelief when we watch movies. But for some small children, they suspend disbelief when they shouldn't. And when you're 12, the world's already a pretty confusing place, where adults tell you what's real and what isn't. And then you find a corner of the internet that feels like a secret that only you and your friends know about. That mystery becomes more intoxicating than the truth, even if you understand what the truth is in the beginning. To Morgan and Anissa, Slender Man offered a dark sort of belonging. He was a gatekeeper to a world where they wouldn't be simply awkward middle schoolers. They had been chosen, but the price of admission was a blood sacrifice. And because the internet had made this myth feel so tangible, the girls believed the only thing more dangerous than killing their friend was the monster who would come for them if they didn't do it. Now, the attack on May 31st, 2014 wasn't a momentary snap or even a sudden burst of rage. It was a culmination of about 5 months of deliberate, methodical planning. Beginning in early 2014, Morgan and Anissa began to treat the murder of their friend not as a crime, but as a mission for a higher power. They communicated in whispers on the school bus and through coded language. They built a secret world where the survival of their own families depended on the death of Payton Leutner. In their minds, they weren't killers. They were proxies. In the Slender Man lore they consumed, a proxy is a servant who carries out the entity's will to prove its loyalty. This created a twisted sense of occupational necessity. They believed if they killed Payton, they would be granted passage into Slender Man's mansion, a physical place that they believed existed within the Nicollet National Forest. It was a very dark Peter Pan fantasy where the goal wasn't Neverland, but to join a house of monsters. But the plan wasn't exactly easy to execute. There were multiple failed attempts before the day in the woods. They had wanted to kill Payton during the sleepover. While she was sleeping, Morgan even brought a kitchen knife from her home, hidden in her bag. But as the lights went out and Payton drifted off to sleep, the reality of the act momentarily paralyzed them. On another occasion, they planned to do it in the bathroom at the park. But again, their nerves, or perhaps a lingering shred of childhood innocence and conscience, stalled them in the moment. This leads to the core psychological question of this case. Was this a shared delusion, or was it coercion? In the legal and psychiatric postmortems, experts pointed to Folie, Deux, the madness of two. In this dynamic, Morgan was likely suffering from early-onset schizophrenia. She provided the primary delusion. She truly believed she saw Slender Man. Anissa, however, played the secondary role. She never saw the monster, but she was so desperate for Morgan's friendship and so suggestible to the proof provided by the internet that she adopted that delusion as her own. It wasn't traditional coercion, though, where one person threatens the other one. It was a mutual reinforcement. Every time one of them began to hesitate, the other would remind them of the consequences. What would Slender Man do if we fail? They trapped each other in this loop of fear and loyalty, and by the time they led Payton into the woods at David's Park that Saturday morning, the plan was a psychological prison. They felt they had gone too far to turn back. To them, the violence wasn't a choice. It was their only way to go home. In the morning of May 31st, it broke with the kind of suburban peace we talked about earlier. To any neighbors looking out their window, they would have seen 3 preteen girls simply walking toward David's Park. Pretty familiar sight in Waukesha. They looked like they were just extending the fun of their birthday sleepover. But inside Morgan's backpack was a 5-inch kitchen knife. And inside of their minds was a finish line they had been working towards for months. They led Payton into a wooded area of the park under the guise of a game of hide and seek. This is the moment where the childhood element of the story becomes chilling. They used the language of play to facilitate a slaughter. Morgan told Payton, "Lie down on the ground and cover yourself with leaves to hide." And trusting her best friend, Payton complied. What followed was a blur of frantic, delusional energy. Reports would state that Anissa was the one who urged Morgan on, whispering, "Go episodic," a phrase they had developed to mean, "Go through with it." Morgan then attacked, stabbing Payton 19 times in the arms, leg, and torso. But even in the midst of this violence, the logic of their delusion remained. When Payton began to scream, Morgan and Anissa didn't run away. They weren't panicked. In fact, they tried to get her to be quiet. They told her if she stayed still and quiet, they would go get help. It was a final devastating lie. Instead of seeking a park ranger or a passerby, they simply turned their backs, walked deeper into the woods, heading toward the highway. Now, these girls weren't running from the police, not yet at least. In their minds, they were heading towards the mansion. They believed that by completing the sacrifice, Slender Man would manifest and lead them to safety. They left their best friend bleeding on the forest floor, convinced that their part of the bargain was over. As they walked away, they said that they felt a sense of relief. They had done what was required. They didn't look back to see if Payton was moving. They didn't check her pulse. They simply stepped out of the trees and back into the world. 2 children, covered in blood, waiting for a monster to reward them for their loyalty. When Morgan and Anissa walked away, they left behind a girl who was never supposed to get up. Payton had been stabbed 19 times. Her liver was pierced. Her stomach had been punctured. And most terrifyingly, one of the wounds had come within a hair's breadth of her heart. To her attackers, they had finished the offering. To the medical world, she was a statistical impossibility. But Payton refused to be a ghost. In the silence of the woods, as adrenaline began to fade and the gravity of her injuries set in, she didn't succumb to the shock. She started crawling. Just imagine the sheer physical and mental fortitude required for a child to drag herself through the dirt and the leaves, clutching her abdomen, moving toward a road she couldn't even see yet. She didn't even know if she was going the right direction. Every inch, a battle against her own body's urge to shut down. She wasn't just crawling away from the trees, she was crawling back to the world of the living. She eventually reached the edge of a bicycle path near Big Bend Road. It was there that a passing cyclist, Greg Thompson, saw her. At first, he thought it was a prank, a child just playing in the grass, but as he got closer, the reality of the blood and the "help me," she whispered, shattered the suburban peace. When the paramedics arrived, they found a girl who was calm despite the chaos around her. Even as her blood pressure began to plummet, Payton was able to give the names of the girls who had done this to her. She was a witness to her own attempted murder before she even reached the operating room. The medical reality of her survival is often described by surgeons as a miracle. One of the stabs had tracked so close to her heart, it had actually grazed her pericardium. One of the stabs had tracked so close to her heart that it actually grazed her pericardium, the protective sac around your heart. If the blade had been the width of a human hair closer, or if the heart had been mid-beat in a different position, Payton would have died in those woods. But Payton's resilience wasn't just in her physical survival, it was in her clarity. She fought through the betrayal of her best friends and the literal darkness of the forest to ensure that the truth reached the light. In a case defined by the people who couldn't tell fact from fiction, Payton became the most grounded, undeniable fact of all. She was the proof that monsters don't win. Now, while Payton was being rushed into emergency surgery, fighting for every breath, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier were just walking. They weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were marching along the shoulder of Interstate 94, headed toward Nicollet National Forest. They had a backpack filled with snacks, a map they had drawn themselves, and the 5-inch steak knife they had used just a few hours before. To them, this was a pilgrimage. To the rest of the world, they were two blood-stained children walking into a trap. The catch happened rather quickly. Based on the description that Payton gave from her stretcher, a police officer spotted the girls near a furniture store about 5 miles away from the park. When the squad car pulled over, there was no high-speed chase. There was no resistance. Morgan and Anissa simply stopped walking. When the officer asked them what they were doing, they didn't offer a frantic alibi. They were calm, eerie, polite, and almost helpful. But the true chilling heart of the investigation lies in the police interview tapes. As the girls were brought into separate interrogation rooms at the Waukesha Police Department, the detectives expected to find terrified children or hardened young criminals. Instead, they found two girls who seemed to think that they were participating in a basic debriefing. Morgan sat in her chair. Her legs dangled. Her face was blank. When the detective asked her about the stabbing, she spoke about it with the same emotional weight as if she were describing a school project. She admitted to the stabbing, explaining it was necessary because Slender Man would have killed her family if she didn't do it. There was a profound, haunting lack of understanding of consequences. When Morgan was told that Payton was alive and in surgery, she didn't look relieved, and she didn't look like she regretted anything. She was confused. She asked the detective, "Can I still go to the mansion if the sacrifice isn't complete?" She was more concerned about the rules of the myth than the laws of the state of Wisconsin. Anissa's interview was equally jarring. She spoke about Slender Man as if he were a neighborhood bully they were trying to appease. She detailed their months of planning with a sense of pride in their thoroughness. When the reality of a life sentence or a prison cell was brought up, they both reacted as if they were being told they were grounded for a week. Their brains had not bridged the gap between the digital creepypasta world and the cold, hard reality of a cinder block interview room. The investigation quickly shifted from who did it to what exactly are we looking at? Because detectives realized they weren't just dealing with a crime, they were dealing with psychological collapse, and they felt like they were way out of their depth. The truth had caught up to Morgan and Anissa, but they were still miles away, lost in the forest of their own minds. It wasn't just an arrest, it was the moment the digital monster finally evaporated, and it left two little girls standing in the wreckage of their own lives they had just destroyed. When the handcuffs clicked shut and the legal system took over, the psychiatric community was left staring at a puzzle that defied all traditional labels. At the center of this puzzle was early onset schizophrenia. And while schizophrenia typically manifests in late teen years or early 20s, Morgan Geyser is considered to be a rare and heartbreaking exception. Clinical evaluations following her arrest revealed that Morgan wasn't just imaginative. She was experiencing a full-scale break from reality that had likely been going on for years. She believed she possessed mind control abilities. She spoke to Vulcan from Star Trek. She spoke to her favorite characters from Harry Potter as if they were sitting in the room with her. To Morgan, the world was a translucent veil where fictional entities were as tangible as her own parents. Crucially, this wasn't a choice. It was a biological inheritance. With Morgan's father's history of the same condition, Morgan's brain was already primed for a distorted perception of the world. By the time she'd encountered the Slender Man mythology online, her mind wasn't processing things as creepy entertainment. It processed it as data. It was a new character, someone to add to her internal landscape, one that happened to be much more demanding and violent than the others. But a hallucination usually stays internal. To turn a vision into a stabbing, you often need a witness. And this is where the concept of Folie, or the madness of two, becomes the biggest part of this case. In Folie, a symptomatic person, in this case Morgan, transmits their delusional beliefs to the non-psychotic person, but highly suggestible. That's Anissa. Anissa never saw Slender Man. She never heard his voice, but she was so emotionally tethered to Morgan and so desperate for the specialness that their friendship gave her that she allowed Morgan's reality to simply overwrite her own. She was the enabler of the delusion. She didn't just believe Morgan. She began to fear the monster for Morgan. They created this closed-loop system together where doubt was viewed as life-threatening betrayal. And this leads us to a relatively new and terrifying concept in modern psychology: internet-based psychosis. And since this case, there have been a lot of different situations where people have become psychotic due to their obsession with the internet. And now, with the invention of artificial intelligence and easy-to-use AI like ChatGPT or Gemini, we are now finding AI psychosis, where people become so emotionally connected to the fake personalities the AI create for them that they can no longer distinguish between reality and fiction. See, before the internet, a child like Morgan might have been isolated. Perhaps she could have had imaginary friends that she saw in her books or on the TV. But the internet is different because it provides 24/7 high-definition reinforcement of whatever it is that you happen to like. In this case, the mythology of Slender Man. For every doubt Anissa could have had, there were thousands of forum posts and eyewitness videos that proved that Morgan was right. The digital world was a megaphone for their mental illness, validating the delusion, providing a community of believers that made the mansion seem like a real place they could go. And the core of this tragedy is the intersection of mental illness, digital influence, and isolation. These girls didn't spend their time in supervised after-school programs or engaging in a wide variety of activities with their peers. They retreated into the digital. In that vacuum, Slender Man grew from meme to God. When we ask why this happened, the answer isn't just the internet or mental illness. It was the way a broken mind found a broken myth, and a lonely friend provided the hands to carry out the deed. A tragedy of synchronization, the moment where a ghost story finally found a host. The legal journey for Morgan and Anissa began with a controversial decision. Despite being only 12 years old, they were both initially charged as adults with first-degree attempted murder. In the eyes of the law, a sheer calculation of the plan, the months they spent hunting their friend, suggested a level of maturity that the defense teams spent years dismantling. When the conversation shifted towards the insanity plea, the court had to determine if the girls truly lacked the capacity to understand the wrongfulness of their actions. This wasn't just about if they were crazy. It was a rigorous, multi-year evaluation of these children's brain architecture. For Morgan Geyser, the determination was almost undeniable from a clinical standpoint. State-appointed doctors watched as she carried on conversations in thin air in the middle of her interviews. She was not just claiming to believe in Slender Man to avoid prison. She actively hallucinated proxies and protectors the entire time she was in custody. As experts argued that her brain was not capable of distinguishing between the kitchen knife and a magical tool. For Morgan, the defect was a documented genetic and active psychotic break. For Anissa Weier, the determination was more nuanced. It centered on that shared psychotic disorder. The defense argued that Anissa's defect was her total psychological immersion into Morgan's world, a state where her survival instincts had been hijacked by a secondary delusion. The court eventually landed on a middle ground that satisfied neither the lock 'em up crowd or the they're just kids advocates. Institutionalization. Instead of a prison cell, they were committed to the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. And to the critics who called this a cop-out, the legal counterargument was the duration of control. In the prison system, you have a set release date. In a mental health commitment, the state essentially owns your freedom until you can prove, to a degree of medical certainty, that you are no longer a threat. For Morgan, this has resulted in a 40-year commitment. For Anissa, 25. They were not set free. They were placed in a high-security facility where every hour of their day they were clinically interrogated, sometimes by their own minds. The not guilty verdict wasn't an exoneration. It was a legal admission that you cannot punish a person for a crime committed while their brain is effectively offline. The question that haunts every true crime story: can a person truly come back from the unthinkable? In the case of the Slender Man stabbing, the answer is currently being written in real time, and it remains one of the most polarizing debates in Wisconsin legal history. Anissa Weier was the first to re-enter the world in September of 2021 after serving 7 years of her 25-year commitment at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. A judge granted her a conditional release. Her transition was not simple. She was not allowed to just walk out the door. It was a calculated, highly monitored process. Under the terms of her release, Anissa is awarded the state until she is 37 years old. She is suspect to 24/7 GPS monitoring, restricted internet access, which is monitored by the Department of Corrections, in mandatory psychiatric treatment. To the public, the sight of the then 19-year-old Anissa returning to the community she once terrorized was a bitter pill to swallow. They launched into a huge debate over rehabilitation versus public safety. Supporters of the release argued that the system had worked, that a child who was formerly broken had been treated and was no longer a threat. Critics, however, pointed to the 19 scars on Payton's body as proof that some lines, once crossed, should not lead back to freedom. Morgan, on the other hand, it's been a lot more turbulent. Because of her diagnosis of early-onset schizophrenia, her commitment was sent to 40 years, effectively a life sentence in clinical settings. While Morgan has made multiple attempts to seek a conditional release similar to Anissa, the court has repeatedly denied her, citing that she remains a significant risk to the public. In one of the most jarring moments in Morgan's post-conviction history, in 2022, a detail many casual followers of the case might not know, she had a moment of stability in which she used that moment to escape from the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. Wasn't a high-speed case. Nothing violent happened. It was desperate. She was confused. A lapse in security, obviously. She was found relatively quickly, brought back without incident, but the escape served as a chilling reminder to the community that there is a thin line between patient and prisoner, and it's easily blurred. For the prosecution, this event solidified the argument that Morgan's grip on reality is still quite fragile, and she still needs to be committed for public safety reasons. The controversy lies in the nature of not guilty by reason of insanity. In Wisconsin, if a person is found to be no longer insane, the state technically loses its right to hold them in the mental institution. This creates a paradox. If the doctors do their job and cure the patient is legally entitled to go home, even if the crime they committed was attempted murder. This is why many true crime fans feel the system is flawed. It feels like a loophole where the punishment is tied to a diagnosis rather than to the deed itself. Not every state follows this. In California, there have been cases where they have committed someone, that person's been cured, and then they immediately file charges and put that person on the stand to defend themselves. Not everybody agrees that that's fair either. Now, while the legal battles of her attackers play out in the news, Payton, Bella Leutner, has been busy building a life defined by more than just those few minutes in the woods. For years, she remained silent, choosing to heal away from the cameras, and then in 2019, she finally stepped into the light. And what the world saw was a masterclass in resilience. Payton didn't just survive, she thrived. Graduated high school with honors, moved on to college, pursued a degree with the same quiet determination that saved her life. Payton has been incredibly candid about the physical and emotional scars that she still carries. She still has the 19 marks on her body, and she has spoken about the difficulty of trusting people. But she has also stated that she does not want to live her life in fear or anger. She has a job, a social life, and a future that she fought for with every ounce of her being. When we talk about what happens when the truth catches up, we usually focus on the killers. But in this case, the most powerful truth is Payton's. She is the living proof that a victim doesn't have to stay a victim. She took a story that was meant to end in a sacrifice, and she turned it into a story of her own survival. As Morgan and Anissa navigate their continually restricted lives, Payton is out in the world, living the life they tried to take from her. And in the end, that's the ultimate form of justice. In the wake of the 2014 stabbing, though, the world didn't just react to this crime. It reacted to a ghost. As headlines blared the name Slender Man on every major news network, a wave of media-driven moral panic swept through the living rooms across our country. For many older listeners, this might feel familiar, like the 2010s version of the Satanic Panic or the 1980s, or the outcry against heavy metal and violent video games in the 90s. The narrative was simple. The internet was its predator, and Creepypasta was the lore. School districts began blocking horror sites, parents were urged to scrub their children's tablets, some even called for the total censorship of digital folklore. But as the dust settled, it became clear that banning a fictional tall man in a suit wasn't the solution. It was a distraction. The Slender Man didn't stab Payton. 2 profoundly struggling children did it. The case forced a much-needed, thoughtful, and painful conversation about internet exposure and using the internet as a digital babysitter. We began to realize that the gap wasn't just in what kids were watching, but in how they processed it. For the iGen and the Gen Alpha, the line between the physical and digital worlds is very porous. Without parental mediation or just teaching your kid digital literacy, a myth feels as heavy as a mountain. More importantly, this tragedy exposed the massive gaps in mental health intervention. We have to ask, how did a child with direct genetic links to schizophrenia, who had been hallucinating since she was a toddler, slip through the cracks of a modern school system? The focus on the spooky internet story allowed us to ignore the much harder reality. Our system for identifying and treating early childhood psychosis are in many ways woefully inadequate. To my older listeners, I want to emphasize this moral panic is a reactionary shield. It isn't a solution. Hiding the scary story won't fix the broken mind or the lonely heart. The broader impact of this case isn't that the internet is evil. It's that digital isolation acts as an incubator for untreated mental illness. The solution isn't better firewalls. It's keeping better eyes on our children, better conversations about what they see online and what they're involved in, and a much more aggressive approach to mental health care before a delusion turns into a plan. We spend so much time teaching our children how to navigate the physical world, how to cross the street, how to stay away from strangers in a park, how to find your way home. But in the case of Slender Man, it reminds us that there is another world entirely, one without physical boundaries or clear-cut rules. Was this preventable? It's the question that still haunts the quiet streets of Waukesha. Maybe the answer lies in the gaps that we failed to bridge. The space between a father's clinical history and a daughter's vivid imagination, or the exact moment a digital myth becomes a life or death command. As Morgan and Anissa continue their journey through the legal system and toward a world even more digital than the one they left in 2014, we're left to wonder, have we learned how to look into the shadows? We tell our children monsters aren't real, but perhaps the real danger isn't the monster under your bed or even the one on the screen. It's the belief that if we just ignore the darkness for long enough, the lights can stay on forever. Sometimes the truth doesn't just come out, though. It catches up. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. Thank you for joining me for episode 96. If you found today's deep dive into the Slender Man case insightful, please leave a review. Please subscribe. You can always find more information about all the different cases that I am covering on TikTok. And I will see you next time as we continue our countdown to our milestone 100th episode in my brand new studio. Until then, keep an eye on the shadows. And remember, the truth always leaves a trail.